video, I'm going to show you how I animated this looping background to make the character look like she's moving using Adobe After Effects. If you want to learn how to animate the character biking, check out my class, Limber Character Rigging to Secondary Animation in After Effects. This tutorial is actually a bonus lesson from the class, so definitely check out the class if you want to learn more. For this animation, I wanted to add a parallax effect to the background to make it look more realistic. If you're not familiar, parallax is when things closer to the viewer appear to move faster than things further away from the viewer. If you've ever been in a moving vehicle, you've experienced this in real life. We can apply this effect to this 2D animation to make the scene look more 3D, as if it has depth. You could use a camera and 3D layers to automate this parallax effect, but I also wanted this animation, including the background, to loop. So I decided to manually move the background layers instead of using a camera. So let me show you how I achieved that. So here in Illustrator, I created my hill layers. So I have 3 different hill layers. I have these front hills, and actually if I zoom out, these hills are way longer than the composition because I'm going to be needing to move the hills through my composition to make the background look like it's moving. So I created these really long hill layers in order to do that. And then I also have this layer called Path and Grass. So that's just going to be a static layer that has the bike path that she's biking on and just a front grass layer to kind of hide the edges of these back hills. And then I have these mid hills. So that's going to be that layer. And notice how this layer is a little bit shorter than my front hills layer. And that's because this layer doesn't have to move as fast, so it doesn't need to be as long. And then I also have this back hills layer, which is also pretty short, and actually it could probably be even shorter. And then the last layer that I have here is just the sky, which will also be static. It took me a little bit of trial and error to get the right width of hills to make the background look like it's moving at the right speed for how fast the character should be biking. So just know that it might take a couple tries to get it right, and you might have to recreate your hills and try again. And you also don't have to have your background be hills. You could do buildings or any other scene that you want to do. Just make sure that you can make it loop by not having anything like that's cut off. So you can see that all of these hills, they finish nicely at like a corner like this, instead of just like being chopped off. Like say I would chop right here. That would be weird because I would see that going by and I would just see this weird cliff in the middle of the hill. So whatever background you decide to do, just make sure that all of your edges are finished, like you don't have a half a building or something. Another thing that you could do is you could add additional elements within your background layers. So like you saw in my final animation, I had some flowers included in the hills, and I did that on the front hill layer and the mid hill layer. And you could just include these elements within these layers so that when you import the layers into After Effects, they'll already be all together. And then you don't have to worry about animating something additional. But just keep in mind that anything that you attach to the hill is not going to have that parallax effect. But in the case of the flowers, since they're rooted into the ground, I didn't want those to have an additional parallax effect. So just including them in the hill layer is perfectly fine. For the sake of simplicity in this tutorial, I'm not going to include the flowers, I'll just animate the hills, but it should be fairly straightforward to add any of those elements that you want to in your animation. Also, keep in mind that if you want to add any elements like flowers, after you've already animated the hills, you could just import those layers into After Effects and then just parent them to the already animated hills layer. So here in After Effects, I have my character biking, and this animation loops over 32 frames. So what I want to do is actually bring this composition into another composition that I'll also add my background layer to. And you'll see why I'm doing it that way in just a second. So to make a new composition with this composition already in it, I'm just going to, in my project panel, grab the biking composition and just drag it onto this new composition button. And that automatically creates a new composition with the biking composition already inside. So now I can just rename this. And now I have my biking scene, which I'll include the background in. So if I play this back, you can see that after 32 frames, some pieces of the animation keep looping, like the body, but some don't, like the legs, and then the ponytail layer ends and the dog's ear layer ends. So I need to make sure that every element within this animation keeps looping for long enough that my background can go by and it will look natural. If I just made the background go by within the 32 frames that it loops, that would be way too fast and you would notice that the background is really repetitive. So in order to make this character looping, I could make each element loop because some of them already do, but I'm going to run into a problem if I do it that way. So back in this biking composition, on the pedals, I have a expression already set on the rotation. And this expression just makes sure that the pedals stay level except when I want to animate them. And so I couldn't just easily add a loop expression to the pedal to make the animation of the pedals and the biking keep going. So instead, I'm going to loop this entire composition in my scene composition. To do that, I'm just going to go back into my biking composition, and I'm going to trim this composition to the work area. But actually, I need to make it 1 frame longer. So this animation loops over 32 frames. I'm just going to drag this work area out 1 more frame so that it's 33 frames long, or 103. And the reason why, you'll see in just a second. So to make this composition 33 frames, I can just right-click on the work area and do Trim Comp to Work Area. Now back in my biking scene, you'll notice that the length of the comp has been updated. And the reason why I trimmed this at 33 frames is because you'll see that the last frame that this animation is visible is 32 frames, and then at 33 frames, it's gone. So that's why I wanted to make sure that it was 1 frame longer so that the last frame that I need to be included will be visible. And now what I want to do is just loop this composition over and over within my longer composition. So what I'm going to do is right-click on this biking composition, go up to Time, and then Enable Time Remapping. And that's going to add this Time Remap property onto the layer. So what I need to do is go into this layer, and it set keyframes for me for the start and end of the composition, and also extended this layer out. But after the last keyframe, there's nothing. So what I want to do is add a loop expression to the time remap property so that it plays these first 32 frames over and over for the rest of the length of this biking scene composition. But first what I need to do is set a new keyframe. So my last keyframe that was automatically set for me is at 103, but nothing is showing up here. So what I need to do is go back 1 frame and set another keyframe at 102 or 32 frames. And then I can delete this last keyframe here. If this step seems a little bit weird and you want to go more in depth as to why I like to do it this way, then check out my class Looping Animated Scenes in After Effects. So now with this keyframe set at 102, I'm going to option click on the stopwatch next to time remap and then type in my loop expression. So it's just going to be loop out and then parentheses. And we can just leave the parentheses, the insides of those, blank because we want what's default. So now if I play this back, you'll see that it's going to loop those 32 keyframes where my animation is playing perfectly over and over and over across this whole biking scene composition. And the length of your composition is important here because it needs to be divisible by the length of time of this animating loop. So 32 frames or 102 is divisible by the 10 seconds and 20 frames that I have my duration set to. So if the duration of your looping composition that's inside of this composition is different than mine, then you're going to want to figure out what your duration needs to be. It just needs to be something that's divisible by however long this animation loops for. Now it's time to add in the background elements. So first I'm going to actually go into my biking composition and just turn off the background visibility so that I can add in the sky in my scene. So now you need to import your background layers. You can do this the traditional method, but I'm going to use Overlord. So now that I have all my layers in here, I just want to move the biking composition up above the path and grass layer and then just lock it so that I don't accidentally move it. Let's start by animating the back hills. So I'm just going to solo this layer. I'm going to duplicate this layer to create a guide for myself. So I'll just hit Command D, and then on this duplicated layer, I'm going to color it a different color that'll stand out. And also just lower the opacity on that. So now I want to animate the back hills so that they start in this position and also end in this position. So I'm going to start at 0 frames, 0 seconds and set a position keyframe. Then all the way at the end of my timeline, I'm going to start dragging the back hills to the left until they meet up with that red guide layer that I've created. And I think that looks pretty close, but I'm just going to zoom in and make sure I get this exactly right. I think that looks good. So now I can just delete this back hills too, that red guide layer that I made. And if I play this back, it should look like it's looping. So that looks like it's looping because these back hills, if I go back into my Illustrator file, you can really see how the back hill is pretty uniform throughout. So I just made this one bump, the starting bump, and then I moved this bump over so that it was in the same place as this starting bump at the end of the composition. And remember that the back hills are going to be moving the least because they need to be looking like they're moving slowest because they're furthest away from the viewer. So now let's move on to the mid hills, which are going to be moving just a little bit faster. So I'm just going to solo that layer. So for the mid hills, I'm going to do this slightly differently. So I'm going to set a position keyframe again at 0 frames, 0 seconds for the position to be right here. And then I'm going to go all the way to the end of my timeline, and I'm going to move these mid hills all the way off. So I'm just going to hold down Shift and drag the layer because that's a little bit faster. And I'm just going to animate that. Let's see, if I had the path and grass layer on, I don't need to get it all the way off because the path and grass layer will be hiding it. So I'll just move it just like that so you can't actually see it. If I turn off the path and grass, you can see it, but that's okay because this layer will be on in the final animation. So basically what I've done is just animated this all the way off. And the reason why I animated it all the way off is because if you look at the file, it's easier to see in Illustrator. This path is not quite as uniform as the back hills layer was. So I'm not going to just line up one hill with another hill within the layer to make it look like a loop like I did for the back hills. Instead, I'm going to animate the entire hills off and back on. So I've animated this mid hills layer all the way off, and what I need to do now is just duplicate the mid hills layer by hitting Command D, and then this duplicated layer I'm going to drag so that the first keyframe is going to be at the very end. So make sure that it lines up with these last keyframes here. So that way you see that I have this hill in the exact place that it needs to be to start the loop over again. But this hill is just popping into place. So what I need to do is extend this layer forward. Make sure that you're extending the layer and not just dragging the whole layer. So you should see this little double arrow for the icon, and then click and drag that to make sure that you're extending the layer. You don't want to click the layer and then move the entire layer. You want that keyframe to stay right here at the end of the timeline. So you look for that double arrow and then extend the layer. And we're doing this so that the layer doesn't pop in. But there's no position keyframes here. And it would be a little bit tricky to figure out what the position keyframes need to be to start it all the way off over to the right and animate on, because I need to figure out the right speed, and that would just get complicated. So an easier way to do this would just be to turn off the position keyframes, and making sure that my playhead is at the very end of the timeline, I'm going to take these second duplicated hills and parent them to the original mid hills. And that way, this layer is going to be controlling the position of this layer, so I know that it's definitely going to be at the right speed. So now, if I were to play this back, you'll see that it loops perfectly. You've probably noticed that as this loops, when it gets back to the beginning, this little corner of the first hill is just popping off, and so it's not actually looping perfectly, it seems, but when I add in this path and grass layer, it's going to cover that up, so everything will look just fine. Now I need to do the same thing on the front hills to make the front hills loop. So I'm just going to solo the front hill layer, and then set a position keyframe at 0 frames, 0 seconds for it to be in this position. And then I'm going to go to the end of my timeline and then just drag this layer all the way off. And actually, I think that I want a little bit of this hill to be at the beginning, because when I look at my composition here, I think it could use a little bit of the hill right here. So instead of dragging this all the way off, I'm just going to have a little bit still remaining in the scene. And then I'm going to need to make another duplicate to accommodate this and make that part of the hill loop. So now that I have this hill animating across, what I'm going to do is just solo those hills again, and then I'm going to duplicate this hill, the front hill layer, and I'm going to bring this duplicated layer so that the first keyframe is all the way at the end of my timeline, just like I did with the mid hills. And then I need to extend this layer, so I'm going to make sure that I'm dragging with this double arrow so that I'm extending the layer and not dragging the layer. And that way this is not going to pop on, but it's also not animating on. So to fix that, what I'm going to do is turn off the position keyframes and then parent this duplicated hills layer to the front hills original layer so that it is also animating from right to left onto the scene. So now if I just speed through this timeline, you can see that this main hill is looping, but that little section at the end that I decided last minute to add, that part is not looping. So what we need to do is duplicate this front hills layer again for this part of the hill to be looping. So I'm going to duplicate that, and making this section of the hill loop is going to just happen the opposite way that making this section of the hill loop. So with this second duplicate, it's named Front Hills 3, I'm going to take this layer and drag it all the way forward so that this last keyframe lines up with the first keyframe. So that way this hill over here in the left corner is going to be here at the beginning of my timeline. And then it's just going to pop out. So I need to extend this layer. So I'm just going to make sure that I have those double arrows so that I'm extending the layer, and I'll just drag that off to give it enough time to be animated out. But again, this is not animating out because this is the last keyframe and there's no more keyframes here. So I'm just going to do the same thing that I did to make the other duplicated layer loop. So I'll just turn off the position keyframes and then parent this layer to the front hills so that it'll just be attached and have the same speed as the front hills. So now when I play this through, this little front hill is animating off, and then it animates right back into the same looking hills at the end of my timeline. So if I play this back, you'll see that that makes a perfect loop. So at this point, our whole animation should be looping perfectly, but actually there's one more thing that we need to do to make sure that it's absolutely perfect. So I'm just going to hit U on the keyboard to bring up all of my keyframes, and I can ignore the ones on the biking layer. And these last keyframes are on 10 seconds and 19 frames. And so with the background, 10 seconds and 19 frames is going to be in the same exact position as 0 frames, 0 seconds. And in order to have a truly perfect loop, you don't want your first frame and your last frame to be the same, because when it loops, you'd have 2 of the same frame in a row. So what we need to do is just take these position keyframes and drag them over 1 frame so that they are at 10 seconds and 20 frames. And so our playhead technically can't reach over there, but that's okay. We just want them 1 frame past the playhead. And that way, 10 seconds and 19 frames is not the exact same as 0 frames, 0 seconds. So that way it'll be a perfect loop. So now that it's going to be looping perfectly, let's just play it back. So that's how I animated the background of my scene, and hopefully that helps you to animate the background of your scene. If you're interested in learning more about creating looping animated scenes, check out another one of my classes, Looping Animated Scenes in After Effects. In this class, I focus on making elements move across a scene with a static background, and in the case of this biking animation, we did the opposite. We moved the background while the subject stayed static. And again, if you want to learn how I animated the character biking, that class is called Limber Character Rigging to Secondary Animation. Both classes are linked below, and by using my link, you can get a free trial to Skillshare to check out all my classes and thousands of other classes on Skillshare. Thanks for watching. Until next time, happy animating!